The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, joining you live from Dallas, home base for me. If we've not met yet and you don't know me, I'm a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose. My team and I help companies to detect and articulate their purpose to thread it through culture and operations. And we work with forward-thinking and forward-reaching organizations to develop inspirational leaders who create cultures where people actually want to come to work and do their best. We also provide programs that enable individual team members and leaders to discover and unleash their passion and purpose at work to catalyze fulfillment, engagement, and productivity. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at elisecortez.com. Also, if you like the content of the show, you might want to check out my book that's called The Great Revitalization. It's due out in March of 2023. You can get it on Barnes & Noble and also other pre-sale outlets. Now, if you're just joining us, here we are. I want to kick off the program. With us today are the authors of The Risk Paradox, Life Lessons from 102 Amazing Risk Takers, which is due out today, October 4th. We'll be talking about it today on the show. Alan Ying joined us from Houston, Texas, and Doug Schneider is coming in from Cincinnati. Alan and Doug, a hearty welcome to Working on Purpose. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having us. Great to be here.
It is so beautiful. As you know, I just look at this gorgeous thing that you guys birthed into the world. It's so beautiful. Look at this. And as you both know, I absolutely loved reading. It's chock full of great information and just a whole bunch of inspiration. That's a great match for me. So let's start by introducing you to our listeners and viewers from around the world. Would you each share just a little bit about your backgrounds, and then I have to know how in the world you guys came together to write that beautiful book?
Sure. So Alan and I met in 2006, and I was a senior executive at a large healthcare information technology firm, and we had just bought the company that Alan founded, which was based in Raleigh. So that's the connection. That's how we met. And then subsequent to that, about 5 or 6 years later, Alan helped convince me to take a risk myself. And I became CEO of a software company and ran that company for 5 years.
Wow, wonderful. Welcome. I love that whole collision of minds and hearts. What about you, Alan?
I started off as a doctor. So I was a cardiothoracic surgeon at Duke, and I somehow started a software company and learned a lot about
accidentally along the way somehow.
Yeah, accidentally tripped on that log, and we unbelievably did really well, and then sold it, and then I unbelievably got lucky again and did well at the public company where Doug and I worked together, and then I've just been on a lucky streak. I've run and invested in and sold a lot of other businesses since then. Have not seen a patient in the last 22 years, though.
Wow. It's remarkable. I'm glad to know both of you. You're both enriching my life already. So let's now kick off for our listeners here some beautiful promise here of how you situate what you've worked on here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read a little bit from your book and then have you comment on it. So I know that you interviewed 102 people, both that split between men and women, who took risks, and you saw many differences. And you started looking at the patterns, and then you said, how could we make sense of this whole smorgasbord of human behavior and circumstances? And this was interesting. You said about halfway through your interviews, we realized the first lesson was right in front of us. You say the people we were talking to were alive. They were deeply engaged in the world, in their lives. When they succeeded, they savored their accomplishment, and then they moved on to the next risk. When they failed, they took the lessons of those failures and added a dose of humorous self-reflection and searched for their next challenge. I think that is wildly inspirational.
Yeah, the patterns of the book. So we didn't start off with any theses or hypotheses besides kind of the, I don't know, intrinsic biases we developed growing up or based upon our own experiences. We weren't testing, oh, let's see if people, I don't know, are adrenaline junkies or anything like that. We just listened to their whole life stories. And that took a long time. You're looking for patterns. And it was exactly as written, which is all of these people were so different, wildly different. Men, women, immigrants, natives, lifelong kind of multi-generational Americans, people on all different continents. The key is that they embraced the risk, and sometimes they jumped off the cliff on their own. Sometimes there was the wind pushed them off. But when it happened, they certainly embraced it. So that was the main big, that's how the risk paradox came up, which was, when people go through, your listeners are going to be thinking, oh, should I have Chinese or, Mexican tonight? Or should I have, I had a bad meal at this other place. Or they could be thinking about switching jobs. They could be thinking about quitting. They could be thinking about striking out on their own. The unspoken assumption there is that if I do nothing, that is no risk. And that was the key thing there was, you're making a decision when you do nothing. And it's actually a lot of times worse off because you think there's not going to be change and the world has other plans for you. And it's going to change regardless. So that's what we found. The primary pattern was taking a risk was the least risky thing to do if your goal is to have a fulfilling life, because the risk yields learning, introspection, identification of meaning. And those are things that I think there's plenty of research on that are aligned with a fulfilling life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go on to the next question, but didn't know if, Doug, you wanted to add anything to that?
But the one thing I think I'd add is that, I think it probably makes the book more interesting. Alan and I have very different orientations towards risk.
Yes.
And when I met Alan, he had just, as I mentioned, he had just sold this company to the company I was with. And he told me the whole story of how he sold the company and the negotiation and all that. But I got stuck on, okay, here's a guy who was a surgical resident at Duke in the middle of a prestigious program. And he left to start a software company with no customers and working out of somebody's apartment. And I just couldn't, so part of the genesis of the book was that started essentially a 15-year conversation about risk-taking and innovation between the two of us, where we both realized that even though we looked at risks differently, what we had in common was we were very curious about why people take these kind of risks.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. That's so great. Well, we probably should do something fundamental here, and that's actually to talk about what we mean by risk. So let's do that really quick. So you say in your book that risk is commonly defined as the potential for uncontrolled loss of something of value or the intentional interaction with certainty. So would you say you have a different view on the matter? So would you actually articulate your view of risk, your definition of risk?
So what I would say is that risk plays out mostly. So I would say that it plays out mostly in moments of truth in people's life. So if you think about your life, there's moments where you're at a crossroads and you have to make a decision, and it's in those moments of truth that we all grapple with our orientation towards risk. And as Alan already said, a lot of times we assume that if we don't take the perceived risks, that the status quo is just going to stay the same. But that, I think, can be an illusion. And so we ran into, in the book, we ran into many of these moments of truth of all different kinds. It could be a financial crisis, the market crash, which, if you're a real estate investor, that has a huge impact. It could be a unplanned pregnancy. It could be a relationship breakup, but it could be a job opportunity, just a really good job opportunity, but one that requires you to sort of stretch and go to the next level. And I think that's where the risk decision plays out.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So one of the things that I really love about your book, you're the subject of your book is risk, and oftentimes, from my own vantage point, when people talk about risk, there's a lot of analysis, risk analysis, strategizing for risk. What I love about your book is you humanize it. So I have to read for you, listeners and viewers, something else they say here, which I so resonated with. You say, in time, we came to understand that taking risk in some significant way is fundamental to becoming yourself. And becoming yourself, realizing your potential as a human being, is crucial to life fulfillment. Risk takers, sometimes consciously, and sometimes with minimal introspection, are on a constant journey to realize their potential as human beings. Oh, that's worth getting up for.
Yeah, for us, it was. I don't actually. We didn't have some grand plan of we're gonna, we're not saying that we've solved the meaning of life or anything. I think we just, did some interviews and found some interesting correlations and patterns. But there weren't any exceptions around this. And if there were stupendous failures that people would look at among these risk takers. And if you read their stories, it's, they're not, hero worship biographies of people. It's, this was a total faceplant. Here's where things went horribly wrong. It's very difficult, I think, for people, like we call it moments of truth, capital M, capital T. Mm-hmm. And it's like, but, it's very difficult to empathize and humanize it when you think of all of those things as only, the 4th down and 1 yard call, in the Super Bowl in the 4th quarter down by 5. And that's what a moment of truth is. What we found is yes, some of those are really big in founding of companies. But along the way, there are lots of those. It's deciding to, graduate from a college and go, take the job, or don't take the job that everyone thought you should. That was hugely prestigious and everyone would kill for. To go for the nothing, no name job where, I don't know, you thought you might learn something. That's a huge risk, when you have it basically in the bag that you could follow this path that largely assures people of the things that society tells you should value, which is prestige and wealth. Right. What we found was when you take it in a grouping, it was the risks that mattered. The money wasn't what mattered in the end. The recognition wasn't what mattered at the end. It was the meaning derived from the risk that was meaningful to them.
Well,
so the accumulation of risk doesn't, the accumulation of wealth doesn't mitigate the need to take risk in your life. And that came out in profound ways. What we found was that even if you've accumulated wealth, you still need to find your meaning and purpose. Mm-hmm. And you need to often risk your reputation, your status, your relationships. So we found it to be more of a lifelong journey for everybody. And we interviewed people all across the age spectrum.
Mm-hmm. You see why that so smacks down my alley, why it's so exciting and stimulating for me to be talking to you two. So beautiful. Now, you already sort of spoke to this, but I just want to make sure we really treat it, because I think it's just so important for our listeners and viewers to get this, because I hope, listeners and viewers, that you're encouraged by this idea of risk and what it can do in your life. You say that what you learned here led you to the risk paradox, which is this. You say taking a risk is the least risky thing you can do to live a fulfilling life. That is so profound.
Yeah, I think the stories are beneficial in humanizing it.
Yes,
When you
absolutely.
only get the tidbits and the photoshopped Instagram reels, or whatever ego propping up articles that people write about, it's difficult to humanize it. It's hard to put yourself in those shoes. But when you start from when they grew up as a kid and you go through and you take the journey on this, these people didn't have it figured out. And it's easy to look at it in retrospect and say, man, you made a ton of money from that, or that business was worth $1 billion and you did all these things, but they didn't know.
Right.
And a lot of it, they failed, all of them, they failed somewhere along the way. But it was the meaning from it. I mean, the listeners should think about, I don't know, all of us in high school having a crush on someone and deciding whether or not to go ask them out. Right. And it's not a capital M, capital T moment of truth for your life. But you probably learned something from it, whichever way it turned out. And we just found that when you escalate that and expand it, the meaning goes up, the riskier it gets. And if we figured out that money isn't the meaning of life, and a job title isn't the meaning of life, and the number of likes on Instagram isn't the meaning of life, then what is? You got to find your own meaning. And it seemed like for us, the way to do that was to take appropriate risks that created meaning for you.
Works for me, gentlemen, works for me. So been enjoying this. We've been talking here on air about how they wrote the book, what they kind of learned along the way. We're going to take a short break here, and afterwards we're going to start getting into the 6 categories of risk that they found and hear some stories about each one. I'm Elise Cortez, your host. We've been on the air with Alan Ying and Doug Schneider, who are the authors of The Risk Paradox, Life Lessons from 102 Amazing Risk Takers. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back. Before we get back into the program, I do want to invite you to check out a book that I wrote a couple of years ago. It's called Purpose Ignited. And I really wrote it to awaken readers to their passion and purpose and help transform them into inspirational leaders who enliven the workplace and elevate the contribution of business to all its stakeholders. I also use it as the basis of my Vitally Inspired program. So I hope you'll check it out. If you're just joining me today, my guests are Alan Ying and Doug Schneider, who wrote The Risk Paradox, Life Lessons from 102 Amazing Risk Takers. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So now, listeners and viewers, you're in for a treat. We're going to actually talk about the 6 categories of risk that they found and hear a little bit about what that looks like in real life. And maybe as we go, maybe you can identify which one you're heading toward or are prone to. So let's hit the first one, the idealists. So I want to hear how do you describe the idealist, and let's hear a story or something from it.
So idealists are people who maybe some of your listeners will see themselves this way, where they have a really firm understanding and idea of the way the world should be. It could be around meat, or it could be around energy, it could be around a product. It could be around the way a company works. It could be anything, but they have an idea around how the world should work, and they have that vision and they pursue it. I'll give you an example. One of the people we interviewed, it was so amazing. Just to pin her down to one was difficult to do. Young woman, went through, graduated law school, had a really clear view around, so first year lawyer, and had a really clear view about medical malpractice and how it was the injustices of it. So the good kind, whereas like something really bad happened and a lot of people really got hurt. And it was a white shoe firm. They didn't want anything to do with it. They gave her no budget. She kind of drummed up a bunch of business, which ended up being more than the business of the whole firm. They changed her comp because she was the only woman in the firm, which was also another topic of the book, gender differences, and totally screwed her, basically. And so she wasn't going to get any of the benefit. She leaves as like a first-year law school grad, starts her own firm to take on the entire pharmaceutical and medical device industry. It is the absolute worst thing to do. There's no money along the way, and you just have to pour money into it. You basically have to have a huge war chest in order to go to war with companies like that. And she does, for these clients who got hurt. And she just thought it was wrong. It was, the world shouldn't work this way. And someone is going to hurt someone else and know they did it, they should pay. And I mean, just on the edge of bankruptcy for years, cardboard boxes and tables, so inspiring. She ended up, after 13 years, she had some wins along the way, but she was involved in the largest medical malpractice litigation settlement in the history of the United States. This is the real Erin Brockovich, in the medical malpractice industry. She led it. It was incredibly inspiring, and she's still going at it today. Now that she hasn't stopped taking risk, looking at things that shouldn't be the way they are, whether it's climate change, tobacco, et cetera. So those are idealists.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. I just want to echo something that you wrote in your book that I think that really speaks to that so beautifully. You say, more than others, idealists are driven by live with six, mission transforms risks. So you say not only do they believe in their missions, they feel it in their bones. I think that's just exactly, I remember that story very well, Alan. It's an amazing story and a great example of the idealists. Oh my gosh. Okay, let's go on to the adventurers.
Everyone knows somebody like this. Maybe it's you, but it's the person, your friend, your buddy, your girlfriend. You're like, what are you doing? And how can you do that? And they just speak as if it were nothing. And it seemed like a good idea. The vernacular for this, you might call them the risk junkies, and not super introspective about it. They're not beating themselves up. They're not super anxious about it. It's on to the next risk. And there are failures involved. There's a gentleman we profiled in the book, started from nothing. And the only way to come from nothing and build the type of empire that he built was, some of your audience members may remember getting free credit card offers in college if you filled out an application. And he did that a lot, used it to buy property without any type of cash, actually. So this is maybe not in the handbook of the right things to manage your money, but used multiple credit cards to buy properties and kept doing it. Ended up making, coming up with a formula to do it. He built up, eventually over the entire Eastern Seaboard, a $250 million plus real estate empire that eventually just cratered because of the financial crisis, which affected the real estate market. And then his story gets even more interesting from there, which is he just kept taking risk to work himself out of the jam. And you talk to this guy, and I don't know, it just almost doesn't register with him. Years later, it just seemed like the right thing to do. And those are the adventurers. You talk to them, and even when they look back on it and you say, that seemed a little nutty, or what were you thinking? I don't know, it seemed like a good idea. And they just move on to the next thing. And they were incredibly entertaining, charming, and to speak with.
Yeah, you say in the book, I remember that story as well, of course. You say in the book that the adventurers live in the present and they don't spend time looking back with regret. There is much to learn from adventurers. They are joyful warriors navigating an often complicated world. Wow, what a way to play with life.
They're inspiring. I would say with all of these, first of all, no one's all one thing, as we all know about personality and psychology research. But they were definitely inspirational. And I'm not an adventurer, but I could certainly take lessons from that.
Yeah, I'm not either. I'm more in the next camp here, the liberators. Let's hear about the liberators.
The liberators, who know, maybe there are some people with the current trend around, quiet quitting or the great resignation. There are people who desire independence. I think it's a topical issue, but I don't think it's exclusively current. These people were of all ages. For fans of Office Space from years ago, Living in a Cube, Dilbert cartoons, etc. It is irreconcilable with them, and they have to find a way out. And taking crazy risks, if in a vacuum, doesn't seem as bad. The downside of that doesn't seem as bad. We had one gentleman also profiled in the book. He honestly, it was almost like a movie story. He was just really good at his job, which he had no interest or passion for at all.
Wow.
And he didn't have any meaning. I mean, just young single guy, all the money that he could want. There's just no meaning there. What he cared about was spending time with friends and family, and wanting that to be his life. He eventually, what a crazy story, moves cross country, not knowing a soul, doesn't know the area in a major city in the Northwest, decides while he's canoeing in Alaska with his friends, this guy was in software and Windows, and that he's going to open up a brew pub.
Yes.
And that's what he wants with his life.
In Portland. Yes.
In Portland, comes back and starts it. He, there's no assurance of success. He actually does what everyone dreams of. He got fed up with his corporate cubicle job, and on a company-wide conference call, told them to take this job and shove it. And then he burned that boat, and he had to make it work. The story that I remember there, the scene that I remember, he was working tirelessly night in and night out. I mean, I cried when he told me this. I actually still have a relationship there. This story, he began dating his current wife, and they were dating, honestly, only for a couple of weeks. And he was really stressed out because he went to go use his debit card to buy a 6-pack of eggs to make for breakfast the next day. And his card was declined for an insufficient balance. His girlfriend at the time notices that he's stressed and says, and he's like, I don't know if we can make it. I don't have the money. They've been dating for 2 weeks. She's a teacher, does not come from money, and says, well, I've saved up $10,000. Will that help? That's Saturday night. She empties her life savings on Monday. And, I'm sure there's a significant number of your viewers who drink this beer. It is it's won the National Brewery Award multiple years. It's one of the most successful beer brands, craft beer brands in the United States. And I'm so pleased for them. And they weren't going to make it. And that's just such an incredible story, just to find freedom.
Mm-hmm. It's just a beautiful story. Yeah. And that's the other thing. I certainly, I really admire people that are up to something. That's just, and so she clearly, was invested in him already and probably loved that he was up to something. How amazing is that? And I can certainly also relate to this notion that you say about the liberators, is that they're less driven by the specific idea that they are pursuing than the desire to own their own life. I really, really can relate to that as well. Okay, we got a couple of minutes before we go on the break here. I want to get all of them. So let's get the next one, survivors. So talk to us about survivors and what they're like.
So survivors are stories of resilience and perseverance, where people just, find their way through. And we have incredible stories in the book of all sorts of perseverance, from financial circumstances, from health conditions, cancer. But the individual that I'll highlight here grew up in a faith-based environment in Virginia. She got pregnant in the 9th grade. She decided to get married. Her parents were supportive of that. 2 years into the relationship, it became clear that it was abusive. She went to the YMCA or the YWCA to get help. And they said, look, you can either be a victim or a survivor. And she wrote down her goals. She had 4 goals. One was to finish high school. The second was to own her own home by the time she was 25. The third was to create her own business by the time she was 30. And the fourth was to meet her knight in shining armor. And she accomplished all 4 of those goals. And then with her knight in shining armor, she moved to California. She got into the recruiting headhunting field and ended up forming working on temporary staffing, and moved back to Virginia, started a franchise business in the temporary staffing industry. And then she and her knight in shining armor went off on their own, and they're now on their 3rd incarnation of the temporary staffing business, with over 60 million in revenue, 40 full-time employees. She's incredibly successful. And it really all started when she decided that she was going to be a survivor, as opposed to be a victim.
I love that. I just love the idea that you talk about in the book too, that anything that life throws at these guys and gals, they just make it work. They never get knocked down. So I think that's just so worth celebrating. And okay, so that's our survivors. Now the seekers, which I also very much relate to. So between the seekers and the liberators, I probably am more of a seeker, but let's hear about the seekers.
Yeah, I think I'm probably a seeker myself. And seekers, I think, are driven by the desire for meaning and purpose. And one of the more interesting stories we have of a seeker is an individual who grew up in a family business. It was an incredibly successful family business. He worked for his father, but his father was very domineering, and he had everything, in terms of wealth that you could imagine. He had a huge house. He had a wife, 3 kids, and he eventually decided that he just couldn't deal with the dynamics with his father. And they decided they could afford to do this, of course, but they decided to move to Spain for 2 years and take the whole family. But the interesting part of that is that they gave away all their possessions. I mean, this guy literally gave his Jaguar to his next door neighbor. And so they relinquished all their possessions. And as he was trying to figure out what to do for his next step, he would get back to the United States occasionally. And he went back one time and he had dinner with his parents. And when he showed up, his father in particular was just furious with him for not coming back into the family business. And they had this very difficult dinner, at the end of which, after an hour or 2, he kind of took a breath. He stood up, he hugged his father and he hugged his mom. He told them that he loved them. And he said, but I can't go back. And he left. And the way that he tells this story, that was when he became an adult. And he was 50 years old at that point. So it wasn't really a story about financial risk. It was more a story about seeking your own purpose and mission. And now he's helping other entrepreneurs create their own businesses. And he managed to pull off that separation. He actually also managed to pull off a good relationship with his parents in the end.
That's amazing. I love that. Let's grab our last break here, and we'll hit the last one after the break here. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Alan Ying and Doug Schneider, the authors of The Risk Paradox, Life Lessons from 102 Amazing Risk Takers. So we covered 5 of the categories. Hang on. We're going to cover the 6th one after the break, as well as some other key learnings. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. One other bit of news I do want to share with you is the second book that I brought out. It's called Passionately Striving and Why. It came out in 2021. That is a collection of stories from 25 women from around the world that I personally recruited from Australia to Zambia, who share their very intimate stories of how they discovered their purpose and are now serving from it. So it's meant to be one part education, one part inspiration. So I hope you'll check that out as well. If you're just joining us, my guests today are Alan Ying and Doug Schneider, who wrote the book, The Risk Paradox: Life Lessons from 102 Amazing Risk Takers. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So we left them hanging before the break. Let's bring them back home and make them whole, shall we? The last category that you found you call the givers. Tell us about them.
So giving, I think, is a universal issue for all humans, a universal desire for all humans. But the people that we highlighted in givers are people who took risk in order to give. And one of the more interesting people that we talked to was an individual who grew up in New Mexico. He was an average student, but he was a very good golfer. And he just really wanted to play golf with his life. But when he graduated from the University of New Mexico with a 2.8 GPA, his father said, "I want you to go to business school." And so he had to talk to a faculty member in order to get a recommendation. And he figured this was going to be pretty easy. Like he would never get into a really good business school. Unfortunately, the faculty member knew the dean of admissions at Harvard. Yes. And so he kind of accidentally ended up going to Harvard Business School. He then became quite successful doing leverage buyouts and bought and sold 9 businesses, made plenty of money, living the bachelor lifestyle. But at 38, he met a woman and she had 4 children. He lived in LA. She lived in Chicago. He proposed to her on the second date, which he would say was the biggest risk he ever took. So he ended up with a family. Shortly after that, he was in a professional group, and they said, "Look, your issue is, what are you going to do with the next 25 years of your life?" And they really kind of made him answer that question. And he decided that he wanted to give back by helping people avoid some of the speed bumps that he had experienced. And shortly after that, he got an opportunity to become a marketing professor at the University of Southern California. So he took the job, even though it didn't pay nearly enough to support his family, which by then had 5 kids. And he ended up 10 years later becoming the dean of the business school, and did that for 12 years. And his whole, when we interviewed him, he was in his early 70s. The last 20 years of his career was really all about giving back.
That's so beautiful. And I also really appreciate what you also said in the book about that, is you say that in the end, many risk takers focus on giving back. It's often their own unique way to express gratitude for the life they have been given and for paying back those who have given to them. How beautiful. What a wonderful way to go through life. All right, now I want to spend the last bit of time here talking about some of the key lessons and concepts that you have in the book that I think are really, really useful for our listeners. So the first one, of course, is that whatever the risks that come, they never fail to teach. And that is so, so true, and really opens access, I think, for us.
Yes, I think that sometimes people, when they think about risk, they think about either overwhelming success, like wild success, or outright failure. But a lot of times people actually end up in the messy middle between those two things, even though they've taken the risk. And what we found, I think, that's very hopeful for people considering taking risk is that even if you don't succeed, it often leads to other opportunities, and it always leads to learning. And so taking that step and taking that leap can be a great teacher in the sense that you always learn something. You also meet new people, and you tend to uncover new opportunities that way.
I think another reason I so love your book, gentlemen, is that so much of when I'm out speaking to audiences, I'm trying to awaken them to their passion, their purpose. And what I find is so many people really are walking through life dead. And when I ask them what they're passionate about, they don't
Right.
know. So I
Right.
think part of the reason I'm so attracted to your book and your teaching is that you're a vehicle to awaken that. So that's why I want to share with my listeners and viewers. So let's go to the next thing. You have a key concept. I love that you have the lessons and the key concepts in your book as well. But one of the key concepts that you talk about is the risk avoidance fallacy. You say believing you can avoid risk by staying in your current situation because it will not change. Actually, everything does change. Very, very interesting idea.
Right. So we found that a lot of times when people didn't take a risk, they assumed that things were going to stay the same and that the next year was just going to repeat itself, and that rarely is what really happens. And so it's probably better to have the frame that risk is part of life, and how you can choose, like any other part of life, how you engage with it and how you deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so of course that's where I of course what I want to encourage confidence, surrounding yourself with the right kind of people, et cetera, to be able to add some fuel to that. Now, another thing that you talk about that, of course, I really heavily relate to is another key concept that you call the inner fulfillment risk. You say when people have everything they need materially, they often experience emptiness and must take more risks for inner fulfillment. I have seen that play out so many times.
Yeah, I think this is where being financially successful can almost become a trap, in the sense that you have everything you need financially, but you need to find a way to keep going. And what we found was that one of the biggest motivators for people to take risk is a mission or a purpose. And if that mission is strong enough, then they will often take that leap to take the risk. And it could be, I mean, there's many different kinds of missions. We interviewed one person whose mission is to provide vocational training to people, to minorities in the inner city. And he located his family in the inner city so that he could form that nonprofit.
So I want to situate this in my world. So as a logotherapist, of course, Viktor Frankl's work, what we would call that, what you're describing there, is the existential vacuum. And the way to fill that is to serve others, which is exactly what you're talking about, right? So it so beautifully aligns. Okay, now the next thing, which I totally want to comment on as well, another lesson learned is you say geographic separation from familiarity can be essential to finding oneself. I can relate to that. Tell us more about that, and I'll give you my example.
Yeah, I think, all of us know, look, we're not all built of infinite wells of self-control and robotic discipline.
Thank goodness.
One of the things they say about losing weight is don't buy it and put it in the pantry so that you're not constantly having to test your self-control of not opening the pantry door. We found that with risk as well, which is, I don't know, tens of thousands of years of evolution and history where familiarity breeds safety and, an emotional feeling of warm feeling. We found this a lot. When you find a way to create a structural barrier or distance from what you're familiar with, you were more likely in our findings to embrace the risk paradox, where the mindset of life is risk. I'm in this situation and nothing is familiar. And so it's all risk. Their minds up to being able to say, okay, I will proceed down different paths. So geographic distance was one of the things that we found that was a pattern.
Mm. I'll just say quickly, I'm from Oregon originally. I spent a lot of time in Portland. That's why remember that story well, the brewery story. But I lived in Spain and Brazil for 3 years in my mid-20s, and I learned Spanish and Portuguese well, learned the culture well. But that being in that different place opened something. I didn't have the familiar cultural icons to connect to, and that's where I really started down the path of meaning and purpose, because I needed something to be able to focus on, and I didn't have it at the time. And I don't think I would have gotten there being back where I was comfortable and familiar in Portland. Okay, so we're getting close to the end here, and I want to be sure and situate this as definitely a hopeful, inspirational way for people to relate to what we've been talking about here. This is so beautifully written, gentlemen. You say, while each of us must find our own path, the good news, and we think it is good news indeed, is that we can learn from the life story of others. Perhaps we can find in others' lives the courage and inspiration to motivate us to act, to keep our own risk, to take our own risks. We learned how taking those risks often leads to unanticipated new paths in life.
The reason we're attracted to stories is, I think, all the way from, I don't know, the Bible and the Quran or wherever, it's stories are what people can relate to. And I found that in my own education. I didn't learn how to be a successful CEO by, I don't know, reading a bullet pointed guide in a 3-ring binder. It was people telling me their experiences. Mm-hmm. And me being able to, I don't know, maybe the shoe didn't fit exactly, but they were shoes at least, and I could see how they walked in them. What this book does, and the reason we did it through stories, is somewhere in there, someone's going to be able to see some similarities to themselves. And sometimes all you need, I found a lot of times with the big risks in my life, all I really needed was being able to see that someone else could do it.
Beautiful. That's so beautiful.
So the one thing I would add is that oftentimes it's the purpose that drives the risk. But sometimes for some people, when they take the risk, they then find their purpose, as long as they're actually committed to the task at hand. And they may find it in relationships, but it's when they take that leap, they may find the purpose that they've been looking for all along.
Oh my gosh, isn't that enticing? Okay, we've done it. We've come to the end of the show. This show is listened to by people around the world. And what it really is, it's a thought leadership platform that advances the conversation on creating workplaces where people actually want to come to work and do their best. We create those inspirational leaders that lead them to their greatness. We do business that betters the world. What would you like to leave them with?
The parting message?
Yes,
I think the parting message for us is risk, and the stories that you read about and biographies and making the big decisions. It's not going to be illuminated in lights for you. It's not going to be the stuff of movies. The stuff of movies came from the normal everyday decisions and having a mindset to embrace, uncertainty and a willingness to learn and a desire to find fulfillment in life through meaning. And if there's one overwhelming thing we found is that, if life fulfillment were a dish, risk is a necessary ingredient.
Beautiful.
I would say that if you take risks, that when you look back on your life, you will not have as many regrets, and you'll be able to kind of connect the dots looking backwards in a way that's important.
What a beautiful contribution to the show, gentlemen. Thank you so very much for being my guests, Doug and Alan. It's been a pleasure to read your book, share you with my listeners and viewers. I thank you so much for coming onto the show and writing what you've written.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Listeners and viewers, if you want to learn more about Alan Ying, or Doug Schneider, or their book, you can either go to riskparadox.net or theriskparadox.net. Either way will get you there. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch a recorded podcast. We were on the air with Robin Short of the Workplace Peace Institute, talking about the work she is doing as a peace-building trainer, working with individuals, corporations, and nonprofit organizations in discovering the root causes of their conflicts so they can transform their relationships and create new and productive paths forward individually and as teams. It was an amazing conversation, so much information. Next week, we'll be on the air with Robert Craig, a previous gutter salesman turned filmmaker who creates works that feature meaningful and purposeful lives. See you there. Remember that working is an integral and important part of our lives. It can be the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we so crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.